Dr. Clay Routledge is the author, a psychological scientist, consultant, public speaker, and professor. Studies basic psychological needs and how these needs influence well-being, physical health, and intergroup relations. Much of his research focuses on the need for the meaning in life and the need to belong. He's published 95 scholarly papers, co-edited 2 books on existential psychology, and authored the book Nostalgia, a psychological resource. And his latest book is Supernatural, which is, I have right here, Death, Meaning, and the Power of the Invisible World, which is published in July of this year, which is what triggers this discussion today. It's interesting on your website you have that you're a behavioral scientist or a psychological scientist, not psychologist. I think there you're maybe making the distinction between the two kind of big organizations in psychology, those that focus heavily on experiments and empirical research, and that in the more clinical and less experimental or less empirical aspect of the field. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. And the other reason I sort of call myself that is because a lot of the things I'm interested in, I think, though my main focus is on what's going on inside the person's head, a lot of the issues I'm interested in touch on other social and behavioral sciences. So I kind of envision myself as somewhat, transcending just the confines of traditional psychology. But yeah, it's definitely more. I consider myself more of an empirical researcher.
Yeah, so you're in North Dakota now. Give us a little background, because I read in your book you made references to living in England for a few years. I presume that's doctoral research or postdoc or whatever. Give us a little CV for you, a little bio of how you got to end up studying the supernatural and the meaning of life from, say, undergraduate days.
Yeah, so I spent much of my life in Missouri. I was actually born in Western Africa, but I spent most of my life in Missouri, and I did my PhD at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And, I was in an experimental psychology lab doing work on human motivation. And that's where I first got interested in existential psychology, or, studying, why humans are so concerned about issues related to meaning and the self, mortality, things like that. I ended up going over to the University of Southampton in the UK for what started out as a postdoc, but then after a semester, I ended up getting hired as a faculty member. And I went there to be part of there's a research center there on self and identity. And a lot of the work I was doing at the time was actually on the psychology of nostalgia. And that was kind of the epicenter of nostalgia research. So that's why I went there. We were there for a couple of years, and, we wanted to move back to the U.S. to be closer to family. And, to be honest, I really like there's things that I'm happy to critique about American academia. we can get into that if you want, but I still think that from my experience, the U.S. still very much has as far as research universities still kind of has the best system for academic freedom and support for that. So I was looking forward to getting back to the U.S. both for family, personal reasons, but also for professional reasons. You know how academia is. You go where you get a job. So I have no, connection to North Dakota, except that, it was a growing upper Midwest research university here. And, that's where I got hired, and, had good laboratory facilities. And
so you say this even in the teeth of the whole safe space movement and microaggressions and the campus craziness and all that. Do you see much of that at your university?
Not really. So I think one of the benefits of living in a more conservative state is that we're a little bit shielded from that. Now, when I say conservative state, I mean the population of the state, including the student body. Of course, most of the faculty are imports, and so a lot of them are more on the political left, I think. And so I think you see a little bit of it at the faculty level. And I definitely, I actually just watched your interview recently with Jonathan Haidt, and I definitely see some of the warning signs that, that he, mentioned in there regarding this, this generational effect of younger students, and I would also say younger faculty as well, being, and I think that actually transcends the left-right dimension. I just think there's this kind of generational main effect of younger people, including the faculty, seem to be a bit more sensitive about these issues and a bit more oriented towards what you may call social justice or political correctness or whatever you want to call it. And where the older guard, people about, 40 or older seem to be more of kind of the old free speech guard of whether they're liberal or not, just kind of they see, the university as a battlefield of ideas and, a place for open inquiry and less about the people's feelings and comfort and, safe spaces and stuff like that. So I definitely see signs of it. I think of it like, I know Haidt, mentions that this is more focused on the East and West coasts, but I think of it like something like fashion. It starts on the coast, but the middle of the country aspires to take on the trends that come in from the coast. So I think it's definitely on its way.
I had Heather McDonald on a couple of days ago. We haven't posted that yet. She has a book out also on this subject, the diversity delusion. Now, she's conservative, and her focus is more on ideology than psychology. So whereas Jonathan Haidt, for example, looks at helicopter parenting and some of the different psychological factors that have happened to kids born after 1995, so-called Gen Zs or iGens, Heather's approach is more like we've given up bourgeois values of like chastity and marriage and two-parent homes and things like that. Although I wonder if it's a distinction without a difference in the sense that ideology really still comes down to human psychology. It's just maybe more of an umbrella word for worldview thoughts, but still those thoughts can be broken down into smaller thoughts, which then translate into behaviors, and we're back to doing psychology again.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, I'm a little bit familiar with her work. I mean, I think there's a connection between the two themes, and that I know Haidt's main focus, or at least from what I understand, was on these changes in parenting and how we're we've the idea of the coddling, right?
Right.
And I think that's certainly true, but looking about it from the other perspective too. Which is, I guess, closer to Heather's perspective, is that these ideologies come from, they come from faculty, they come from certain departments. These are worldviews that are not just, these are organically coming from parents who are coddling their kids. It seems like the perfect combination of the young people show up more sensitive and maybe less resilient because of a more safety-focused culture, but then they're getting these ideas that are really, I think, a function of psychological concept creep, liberal concept creep of concern, focus on harm and feelings and those sorts of issues. And then there is this kind of, I don't know how prominent it is. It's not very prominent here in North Dakota, but you do see this kind of leftist ideology that is, and the reason I say leftist is it seems to be approaching the topic of social justice not from just a pure view of helping people or what's the best way to help disadvantaged people, but it's wrapped in a very political kind of view of the government has a job or the state has a job in this enterprise.
Do you make a distinction between liberalism and the left?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much in agreement with the distinction that a number of people, and I think including you, have made between the kind of the traditional liberalism and the more leftist view. And I'm also somewhat sympathetic to the position that I know a few people have put forward, that a lot of these things might not even really be left versus right in as much as they're these kind of core ideas that maybe people that are more in the center, in the moderate left and moderate right hold on to, and then the extremes on the far left and the extremes on the far right also seem to have some characteristics in common in terms of, more being more dogmatic and really only being for free speech for ideas that they like and against free speech for ideas that they don't like, and more of a purity culture. So I don't know how to connect those. There seems to be some other dimension at play besides just left right, I think.
Yeah, and when you think about having someone like Milo Yiannopoulos speak at your university, I guess the question would be why.
Yeah.
I mean, any university most universities have a lecture series. I've spoken at hundreds of them over the years, and they maybe have a dozen speakers, but on the lecture circuit, there's hundreds of professional speakers. So
yeah,
you can't invite them all. So we're already selecting anyway. So why would you bring in someone like Milo Yiannopoulos? He's not a degree, scholar, scientist, writer. He's just sort of an agitator. And so I can kind of see the argument. Well, first of all, if you invite him, then don't deplatform him. But why would you invite him in the first place? And I remember when the UC Berkeley event was unfolding live on the news with the fires, and he was holed up in some back room somewhere for his protection. And I was emailing the president of Chapman University and going, "Oh my God, this is unbelievable. We should get this guy to come to Chapman." And he's like, "Are you insane? I don't want fires and riots at our university." I thought, "Oh yeah. At first I thought it would be fun to have somebody, such crazy views, radical views. But I thought, yeah, maybe that would be self-defeating. Having a professional scholar, maybe someone like Ben Shapiro, who's a conservative and espouses a lot of those values, but he's pretty sharp, and he's not, a purposeful agitator like Milo is."
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think Milo. I'm not a fan of Milo. I don't really, from what I've seen, I've tried to watch a few of his videos. Back when he was kind of making the rounds, and I didn't find anything particularly intellectually stimulating about. He did just seem like he was trying to be provocative, and but I think maybe in an earlier time, he would have got less attention. And this gets back to the safe space culture thing, because certainly there's been a tradition on the left of having provocative speakers or artists or people. There's this kind of like counterculture punk rock sort of scene of you don't have a guy stand up there in a tie and give a bullet point thoughtful presentation
right.
to excite or to energize students. You have somebody up there that that speaks to their hearts, not their heads, right? And it provokes them. And I think that is, in a way, and I'm not saying that Milo is a good version of that, but I just think he was kind of a right-wing version. He was like the right-wing punk. He was the guy coming in, like spitting on authority, telling if the dominant culture on campus is liberal, then he was the person challenging that, insulting that. And there is, I think, a history of that kind of countercultural presentation on college campuses.
Yeah, I mean, I like the heterodox university idea of diversity of thought, and if you should invite some conservative viewpoints in to speak, but it doesn't have to be Milo. You could have someone like George Will, David Frum, Andrew Sullivan's more libertarian, Heather McDonald is conservative. These are smart, really well-written, well-spoken people. Anyway, so I mean, it's a tough issue, and we're certainly going through some interesting times with that. So let's go back to the bigger picture of your research in nostalgia, existential psychology. I think the average person thinks of existential psychology like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, or the French existentialists, and probably not aware that there's a lot of more recent research in that area. So kind of catch us up on or you talked about the identity and self. The average person probably thinks of self-help psychology of someone like a Tony Robbins, having people walk across hot coals. You're not talking about any of that. So catch us up on what the experimental research is on that, and what's its purpose. What hypotheses are you testing, or theories are you probing?
Yeah. So there's a long tradition in social psychology of research on what we might call the self. And, all the way down to just basic cognitive properties of what's it mean to have a conception of self, and how do we construe the self? What do we think about ourselves versus others, and how does that awareness of ourselves influence, the way we navigate the social world? what I'm particularly interested in is more of this, kind of existential perspective on the self. And that is, what does it mean to be an animal? And as far as we know, the only animal that has an awareness of self that's at such a high resolution that we're really able to turn inward and grapple with, our fragility, our limitations, we're not just aware of, the fact that we're going to die, which is, an area of my research as well, more, the awareness of mortality. But we're also, we can run all sorts of simulations in our head of all the horrible things that can happen to us. And so when we experience an, negative social encounter, being ostracized, for instance, not only do we feel the sting of that experience at this kind of transient, in the moment level, but we can also ruminate on it, and we can worry about, well, what happens in the future if I'm rejected, or what happens if next time it's even worse. We experience this with all sorts of threats, and so unlike my dog or another animal that certainly can experience anxiety in his unpleasant situations that provoke fear or some other kind of emotion, we have this unique ability to really imagine, it's imagination, right? To really think about these things and all the ways they could get worse. Now, on the one hand, these abilities, cognitive abilities of self-reflection, are good because they help us form goals, right? They're part of why we're successful. We can coordinate ourselves in groups and plan for the future. And, I live in North Dakota, for instance, and the people that settled this region certainly would have benefited from having an understanding of the future and preparing for it. And, so a lot of our engineering solutions and a lot of the ways that we, not only manipulate the physical world, but also come up with, create values and standards that we think we should organize ourselves by in society, are the result, at least in part, of our, our ability to reflect on the self and to imagine the self across time. So I'm interested in how, just how that relates to existential questions. Namely, how that connects to what seems to be an innate human proclivity towards making meaning. There's now quite a bit of research that suggests that just the kind of the simple phenomenon of seeing that yourself as having a life of purpose or meaning or mattering in some way has all sorts of predictive power in terms of health, mental health and physical health, in terms of social functioning, in terms of self-control and self-regulation. So if you feel like people depend on you and you have a meaningful place in this world, you're more likely to get up in the morning and be productive, right? You're more likely to avoid temptations and to put hedonistic pleasures aside in the service of more perhaps painful and unpleasant goals. And so there's a bunch of research in that, on the benefits of meaning. So that, kind of in a nutshell, those are sort of the questions and areas that I'm most interested in.
Now, see, theists will say something like, well, religion offers that because of this sort of blanket idea that there's a God and your religion grants this to you. But what researchers like yourself and others are doing is kind of breaking that word down, religion, into more specific things, like having somebody who loves you, cares about you, and reminds you to take your vitamins and don't have the extra glass of wine, don't eat the cheesecake, don't forget to work out tomorrow. And, in other words, instill these values of self-control, delay of gratification, so on, that do have health benefits.
Yeah. No, for sure. In fact, one of the, in my book, Supernatural, I mean, one of the things I try to distinguish is this notion of what I refer to as teleological meaning, which is more of the religious meaning, right? It's saying I have a purpose because I was designed to, but as you acknowledge, there's a whole bunch of meaning that comes from, existentialists, talked about this, right? Like if building your own meaning, like looking at the world and, coming to terms with the fact that there might be no purpose to it, and that you have to, you sort of had to make your own purpose. So I'm definitely interested in that and that distinction too. I mean, I think, one of the things we can certainly get into is there does seem to be some evidence that people who identify themselves as religious have a meaning edge, at least a self-reported meaning edge, and we can get into whether that's a true edge or whether they really do have more meaning or not. But there does seem to be something interesting and unique about religion, perhaps, that not only inspires maybe a unique type of meaning, but it also seems to be related to the other non-religious sources of meaning. So, for instance, part of the reason religion appears to promote meaning is because it connects people to a broader social fabric. And so it might not just be the religion itself, but sort of the kind of the social cognitive landscape that seems to be associated with religiosity. And whether it's a term we sometimes use in psychology called empathetic concern seems to be related to religiosity, and just an orientation towards family and others and sociality seems to be related to religiosity. And
why doesn't the 1960s idea of sort of secular brotherhood of man, and we're all just going to love one another, and imagine no heaven, imagine no countries, we're all just one people, in a secular sense? Why did that not seem to catch on quite as much as religious versions have?
Yeah, I don't know, and I've been thinking about this question a lot. I actually was giving a presentation for my talk for my book a few months back at a secularist kind of event, and so it's an audience largely full of atheists. And this one, during the question and answer period, this one lady stood up and she posed this question to me. She said, I've been involved with the atheist movement off and on for the last 10 or 15 years or whatever. And she's like, it's interesting. And, I obviously keep coming to these things, but she's like, it just doesn't seem like there's not something binding us in the way that there is. And she's like in the church. And she almost expressed some kind of, almost like an envy of that. Like we're trying to replicate, people are trying to replicate this experience of communion. But it doesn't seem to be quite the same. Now, I don't, that's not an empirical observation. That was just her anecdotal observation. But you sometimes hear this, you sometimes hear this within, kind of secular crowds of they want many of the dimensions of religion without the dogma.
Right.
But they're,
part of the humanist movement is to build a humanist church in every city that you can go to for weddings and funerals and ceremonies and meet every Sunday. And I've been to a few of these. There's one in LA, and they sing hymns to Newton and light candles, and they have testimonials of how people lost their religion and so on. They do seem to be kind of trying to replicate those components of religion in the thinking. I'm not sure it's right though, that people need religion, and I think that the word is too big. What is it that people need?
Yeah.
Specifically, I mean, we need community. We need a sense of belongingness. We can and then to your research, we need a sense of existential meaning, that there's some purpose to it. So when someone says, well, the theist says, God gave us meaning, gave us purpose. That's where I get mine from God. Where do you get yours? So how do you answer that in two senses? One, you personally, but also from an evolutionary perspective. How would you scale up from single cells to multicellular organisms to mammals to primates to us, of sort of a purpose-driven, goal-driven, the mouse is driven to get the cheese. How does that relate to me wanting to get a better job, have a great marriage, and have a meaningful life? How do you get there from these more basic evolutionary models? Clay? Oh, did I lose you?
Yeah. Are you?
There we go. Okay, there we go. It's come back. Yeah. Did you hear that whole?
Yeah, I think I got.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I got the gist of it. Yeah. So and as far as for me, as far as the personal question, I mean, I get meaning from my family. Of course, I have. I'm very fortunate to have a good, happy marriage. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary, actually.
Oh, congratulations.
We got thanks. We got married very young, and we've got, 2 healthy kids, and we, and I'm lucky to have, I live far away from my extended family, but I have good social relationships. And I do think and you've touched on it. I mean that seems to be a big part of meaning. In fact, I just saw a paper. I haven't really had the chance to look at it closely, but a new paper just came out where they were looking at the connection between belief in God and meaning. And if I remember the details correctly, what they found is it was the religiosity or the belief in God really seemed to have the most benefits for people who were lonely or didn't have a lot of social connections. And so there is this idea, and people have proposed this idea about attachment theory, that God is kind of the ultimate attachment figure or source of security. And so there is this notion that that if you maybe don't have more what we could call proximal sources of meaning or social support, that there's some benefits to thinking that, well, at least I matter to someone. God has a plan for me, or So I do think these are interesting questions. But in terms of the broader question about that you posed, I mean, there's meaning. People who study this kind of stuff do kind of break meaning down into different levels of analysis. And so at the perhaps lowest level, you can think of meaning as just an orientation towards making sense out of your environment in your world, like seeking patterns or, and how. And so this wouldn't make, this would allow, we could say other animals have meaning perhaps in this way, right? They want to make sense of their world, and it's to their benefit, right? It's adaptive to be able to make predictions in some way. And if you scale that up to the more, cognitively sophisticated, animals like humans being at the top, of course, that also relates to higher order goals. Like we don't just want to kind of make sense of the visual stimuli in our environment. For instance, we want to make sense of our lives, right? So we're able to reflect on ourselves. So we're looking for patterns or orientations that allow us to, to say, well, we're on some kind of trajectory that makes sense. And so this is where you get into, goal research and goal setting, I think. And a lot of we did a survey not that long ago, and we basically just asked people to tell us, instead of giving them, like a scale, we just asked them to write, and so an open-ended format, just tell us what gives your life meaning. And we actually looked at a sample of atheists and theists, and so we have several hundred people in both groups. And we're interested in a couple things. One, just if we just let people tell us what are they going to write, and then can we make some comparisons? What we found, make some distinctions. Are atheists and theists the same in what they write, or are they differences?
Yeah, what'd you find?
Well, so what the first thing we found, which I think is pretty cool, is that everyone, regardless of whether they were a believer or a non-believer, prioritize social relationships with it. So I should say how we quantified this. So we took all the writings, and then we had trained research assistants in our laboratory, code across a series of, using a coding protocol. So basically like word frequency, and so what types of words, and there's dictionaries you can use, of course. And so what we found is people were mainly writing about relationships. That was the most prominent theme that emerged, and that merged across groups. That emerged across theists and atheists. Now, we did find some statistically significant differences too on themes, including the social theme, but also when we broke the social theme down to things like family and parenting and those sorts of issues, we found that believers scored higher, where they wrote more about these themes than non-believers. And there wasn't really difference. We coded for things like career and hobbies and things like that too. But it really was the social themes that stuck out. That's what people mainly wrote about. And the only thing that we found, if I remember right, the only thing that we found a real difference in the other direction, where atheists were more likely to write that their life didn't have meaning. Now, you don't know. I should be clear that doesn't. I think there's an important distinction. That doesn't mean they don't. I'm not sure that that's evidence that they feel like their lives don't have meaning, as much as it's evidence that that they're signifying that life doesn't have meaning. If that makes sense.
Yeah. The question is, what do they mean when they say my life doesn't have meaning? Of course, your life has meaning. I think they're reflecting the theist position with there's no outside source, so there's no external source of meaning. Like when it's all done, somebody comes down and says, "Okay, here's what you did."
Yeah. So in fact, and that also, and there's I'm sure there's a bunch of limitations with this work, but really I think the take home message was that people kind of agree that meaning is really tied up in relationships, and meaning it seems to be that meaning is tied to the kind of the social cognitive, what we might refer to as social cognitive processes involving how we, think about others. And so it's very hard. So a lot of my work on nostalgia, for instance, part of the reason I'm interested in nostalgia is essentially what nostalgia is us reflecting on the experiences from our life that we cherish, that we find meaningful, in terms of autobiographical nostalgia. And similarly, what we find is if you just ask people to write think about a nostalgic memory, think about a memory that makes you sentimental for the past, they write about relationships,
right?
Almost always.
But so that nostalgia, does it require some anchor in the present? Like the reason I'm happy or unhappy now is because looking back, I led a good life or I led a crappy life.
Yeah. So what we have found, we have this kind of regulatory model of nostalgia, and what we've actually found is it is true that current uncertainties or anxieties or unpleasant states seem to trigger nostalgia, but then engaging in that kind of reflection doesn't seem to have negative emotional effects. So it doesn't seem to be that people are doing this contrast where they're saying, "Oh, I'm unhappy now. My life sucks now. Look how great my life was in the past. Now I'm even more depressed." It seems to be more the case, at least for most people, that what they're doing is they're saying, I have some kind of insecurity now, and then I'm pulling these memories from the past to the present as a way to reassure myself. And so we've actually found some evidence that nostalgia increases what we call approach-oriented motivation, and we're actually doing some neuroscience work on that now to see if that's if we can identify the neural processes involved in nostalgia and approach motivation. But what we found from more the self-report and kind of cognitive and behavioral perspective is that after people reflect on these memories, which they're identifying as highly meaningful, they're actually more optimistic about the future. And they have more of a, so we did one experiment which I think is kind of clever, where we had people in the lab and we had them write about, a nostalgic memory, or just kind of a mundane, ordinary memory. And then we gave them, we said, hey, we had them do some other stuff that we didn't really care about. And we said, hey, the study's over, but we actually are trying to recruit people for some future studies that we're doing. Here's a list of choices, if you're interested. And so we gave them like a list of 4 possible studies they could be in. And we're like, hey, do you want to be in any of these and which ones, right? And so what we were interested in is 2 of the studies were things that you would do by yourself. They were kind of these like cognitive studies, and we tried to make them, kind of equal in terms of how interesting they were. So one of them was about like listening to like music preferences, and so there's these kind of things where, okay, I could do this thing by myself. The other 2 studies involved, well, you actually have to work in groups and interact with other people. And so what we were interested in is if nostalgia does in fact orient people towards more what we call approach motivation, if it brings online the social self, as we say, then people in the nostalgic condition should be more likely to be interested in being in the studies that involved other people. And that's what we found, is that that nostalgia made people more likely to say, hey, I'd like to be in the study where I'm working with other people.
Is forward thinking, goal setting tethered to nostalgia, or is it an independent variable in existential meaning? So, for example, I was thinking about this yesterday, listening to Elon Musk and Joe Rogan on that podcast. It's really quite good. Joe basically asks him, why do you do all this stuff? It's insane. And he's like, well, I need a reason to get out of bed in the morning. And for me, I'm going to colonize Mars, save Earth from fossil fuels, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, yeah, that's a pretty good reason to get out of bed in the morning. I mean, that's a huge future goal. But when you were talking now, I was just thinking, is that also tethered to nostalgia? If you have a history of doing that sort of thing, it's easier to point forward to those kind of goals. Could you tell somebody who's sad or depressed or feeling anxious, just set a lot of goals for the future and work toward them, and that'll help you get out of your past angst?
That's interesting. Yeah, no, I hadn't really thought about that. I don't know. I mean, so, one thing we do know related about nostalgia, it does seem to have this element of what we call continuity. And this gets to, kind of this like sense making idea of, trying to have like predictable kind of patterns is when people don't really feel like they know who they are, they're going through some kind of life change, that seems to provoke more nostalgia. So like the loss of a loved one, right. The loss of a job, economic insecurity. So there does seem to be this idea that I'm trying to re-find myself. And so how do you know your best attributes, or what gives you meaning, or the things that you think, kind of motivate you? Well, you do kind of a life review, right? And you look back and say, okay, here's the things I've done before, or here's the positive things that I've had going on before. And you seem to gain inspiration from that. Now I do think there are boundary conditions to this. And so most of the research we've done have been on what we would refer to as normal populations, right? So we're not looking at clinically depressed people, or people that, suffer from some kind of psychopathology, or maybe have some other individual difference that might make nostalgia less helpful, or, so we're just kind of looking at kind of the healthy adult, for lack of a better way of saying it. And it does seem to be, in that case, that the past does seem to be kind of a good mobilizer for planning for the future.
I had Ralph Lewis on the podcast for his new book, Finding Purpose in a Meaningless Universe. Maybe that's not quite I might be messing up the title. Sorry, Ralph. But he's a psychiatrist in Canada, and he deals with a lot of dying people, cancer patients in his hospital, people facing these existential crises. So this is a pretty common thing for him. Then we got talking about suicide, since that was all in the news when we recorded. It was right after Anthony Bourdain and that other woman, the designer woman.
Oh, yeah.
And so he had an interesting perspective that a lot of times people will come to him with an existential crisis, like my life has no meaning, I can't figure out what does it all mean, I don't know what I'm doing, and so on. And then he'll give them an SSRI because they're depressed, and then all of a sudden they come back and go, oh, I don't know what I was thinking, I'm feeling happy now, I don't have an existential crisis, the life is meaningful. And so I do wonder, particularly when I was reading your work, people attribute their feelings to this external source, this existential purposelessness of the universe and the cosmos, and what does it all mean, God, whatever. But really, it's just hormones in their brains that are imbalanced, and when they're back balanced or whatever, then that external source goes away. In other words, it's like you can't sense your brain operating, so when you feel things, it's like, well, something out there is causing this, when in fact it's in here. That's a hard distinction to make.
No, I think so, especially considering, I mean, a similar way of looking at it is, if let's assume that at least the perception of meaning does have some downstream effects on your life. And so where that comes from is, it matters. But at the same time, it seems like some of these psychiatric issues might be that there's brain chemistry that's preventing you from perceiving that meaning, right? So it's not that it's one or the other as much as, one of the issues with the depression, so I did work in, I am as we talked about in the introduction, I am a behavioral scientist, but before I went to graduate school, I worked in community mental health a little bit as a case manager, and so I had a bunch of clients I worked with. And, one of the frustrating things with people with very, very severe depression is they can have a lot of things going on in their life, and they just don't see them, right? They just, they have these cognitive distortions. And so they think their life's, so horrible. And, And really, you're like, no, you have a family that loves you. You're smart, like you're good looking, whatever the case, right? You got things going for you. And then at the same time, there are people that, their life is one tragedy after another. And yet they seem, totally resilient, and they're able to see the best in life. And so, yeah, I don't know what that potential interaction or combination is between, kind of the brain chemistry that seems to really obviously matter. And then the more like, well, then now you have the social cognitive kind of element of you have to be able to perceive meaning and make meaning. But certainly, and I know Jonathan Haidt talked about this and, kind of his view on the coddling. Certainly there's this component of where there's, cognitions are mediating these experiences you're having, and you have some, well, I mean, we could debate whether or not there's such a thing as free will, but you have some mediating role in how you interpret situations, right? And how much of that you can actually control from, like you said, looking for meaning in life, versus how much of that is totally hinged on chemistry, brain chemistry, that you have no control over. I don't know the answer, but we do know from research that certainly perceptions of meaning, wherever they come from, predict a bunch of things, right? So if you have meaning, you're likely to live longer. You're likely to be more pro-social. You're likely to be more, oriented towards the community. If you don't have meaning, you're more likely to suffer from depression, be at risk of suicide, use drugs, all these things.
One of many factors. Yeah, I just wrote one of my Scientific American columns on suicide after reading Jesse Baring's book called Suicidal. I think it comes out this month, September. And the interesting thing about that is what you just said, like the majority of depressed people don't kill themselves. And the majority of people who kill themselves were not depressed. And he went even further to say the people, not only can we not predict who's going to kill themselves, the people themselves probably can't even predict. They don't even know they're going to do it until like the day that it happens. Like something snaps. In fact, Ralph Lewis made this point also, that we have some database, maybe this is in Jesse's book, but anyway, we have a database of people that attempted to kill themselves but failed. So we know what they're thinking because they tell us, this is what I was thinking. Or more to the point, I don't know what I was thinking. I just had this urge and I just did it. And then now I'm glad I didn't succeed because, life is meaningful, whatever. So again, it's human behavior is so complex, that not only do you guys, experimental psychologists, have a difficult time predicting people's behavior, the people ourselves, we can't predict or even understand why we do what we do.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the, the core ideas in my field of social psychology. People aren't necessarily very good at explaining their motives for doing things, right? So you have to kind of come up with these experiments where you try to tease apart different possibilities. I mean, we would say the same thing talking about evolutionary, kind of like mating motives, for instance. If you ask people why they, if you went to a skate park and ask guys why they're doing more dangerous tricks when there's attractive females present, they probably wouldn't articulate an evolutionary explanation, right? They'd just be like, I don't know, it looks cool,
Right.
There's a hot chick standing there.
Right.
So certainly there's a lot of things going on in our brains that that we don't have conscious access to, or that certainly aren't in our focal attention when we're making these kind of decisions. But the suicide thing is a fascinating one. I mean, I'm not familiar with, I haven't read this, this book that hasn't come out yet, Baring's book. But, there's this research in clinical psychology called this theory called the interpersonal theory of suicide. And so this is more focused on suicide or, suicidal idea, like who wants to die by suicide, right? So kind of motive, and this feeling of burdensomeness seems to be a reliable predictor. So people who feel like they're a burden on others are at greater risk for at least wanting to die by suicide. They have this other dimension in terms of likelihood of actually dying by suicide, which is, or at least attempting suicide, which is this what they call like acquired capability. And so it's this notion you can't just want to die by suicide. I mean, there might be a lot of people that are like, yeah, I want to die by suicide, but then they just don't have the ability to do it. And the acquired capability component, it looks at more like things like like building up certain attempts, or being a soldier or a doctor or something that you might have more exposure to pain and to blood and to these sorts of situations. And so there might be this combination of you kind of having the desire to do it, but then also having really the ability or the guts to do it. So yeah, it's a really complex.
Well, there's that data on women have more suicidal ideation than men, but men are far more likely to actually die by suicide. And the reason is the method.
Yeah.
Guys jump off of buildings and use guns, and that's not a forgiving method.
Yeah, no, yeah, guys definitely use way more fatal methods. So yeah.
We get more Darwin awards.
I love what you've probably seen some of those graphs where they have like gender differences or sex differences and like fireworks related fatalities.
Yes. It's hilarious.
I mean, there's definitely like guys do a bunch of stupid stuff.
There's several Twitter accounts I follow on that. One of them is like, hold my beer while I.
Oh yeah, that one's a good one.
Yeah,
I've seen
and
that.
then the Darwin Awards, and they're always
Darwin
hilarious.
Awards.
Well, I first encountered your latest research for one of my Scientific American columns, which I titled "Sky Gods for Skeptics," which was a spin-off of an earlier title I used for a review called "Deities for Atheists." That is, we like to believe that there's something out there, but if I don't believe in God, I can believe in extraterrestrials. So you published this great paper, "We Are Not Alone," in the journal Motivation and Emotion. In which you found an inverse relationship between religiosity and ETI beliefs, extraterrestrial intelligence beliefs. That is, those who report low levels of religious belief but high desire for meaning show greater belief in ETIs. In study one, subjects who read an essay arguing that human life is ultimately meaningless and cosmically insignificant. You really subject your undergraduates to that? We're statistically significantly more likely to believe in ETIs than those who read an essay on the limitations of computers. In study two, subjects who self-identified as either atheist or agnostic were statistically significantly more likely to report believing in ETIs than those who reported being religious, primarily Christian. In studies 3 and 4, subjects completed a religiosity scale, a meaning of life scale, a well-being scale, an ETI belief scale, and a religious/supernatural belief scale. Quoting you, lower presence of meaning and higher search for meaning were associated with greater belief in ETI. But ETI beliefs showed no correlation with supernatural beliefs or well-being beliefs. Now, I've written on this subject a few times over the years, and including one on analysis of SETI scientists who almost to a person are atheists, and yet they seem to have this almost religious fervor about searching for ETIs. And I remember getting a kind of a stern, critical email from Jill Tarter, the head of SETI, and saying, that's not why we search. It has nothing to do with existential meaning, supernatural beliefs, gods, deities. Shermer, you're off. We're looking because they might be there, and this is a pure scientific search. Like, yeah, okay, all right, fine. Yes, of course, it is great science. But my sense has always been like yours, that it does touch something deeper. And Sagan himself made this point. It seems to touch like a deep religious need or belief or whatever, that there's somebody, not something, somebody out there that knows we're here and cares about us. Yeah,
no, I think that's right. In fact, it would have been great to be able to get you to be as an author on that paper, because you're writing on this, particularly. I think it was in, if I remember correctly, The Believing Brain. Really inspired some of this work. Some of this work we're doing. So more broadly, we were just kind of doing work on kind of what we refer to as the substitution hypothesis, which is it the case that at least for certain people, if they abandon more traditional religions, might they search for substitutes in more secular or non-traditional ways? And we've looked at we're looking, or I guess we're still looking at this in a lot of different domains, from things like astrology to witchcraft to belief in paranormal beliefs about ghosts and things like that. But reading your work was part of the motivation for thinking about the UFO dimension. especially considering that there is it's a kind of it's got this like superficial, so when I say superficially, I'm not talking about the real scientists that are just looking for life, but there is this there are a lot of these beliefs that involve not these real conspiracy theories that aliens are responsible for our civilization, or they're monitoring our behavior and the government's covering these things up. And so there is these things are really magical ideas, but they're superficially wrapped in kind of techno scientific jargon often. And I think that kind of helps people feel like, oh, we're not doing silly stuff. Because a lot of times you'll ask people who are into UFOs if they're into other kind of magical things, and they'll be insulted. They'll be like, what are you talking about? I don't do that. And they're like, well, you're going all in this thing that there's really not any evidence. You're taking a leap of faith when it comes to believing that there's aliens among us, but you're laughing at people who believe in spiritual energy.
Right.
So a lot of, I think these people it is kind of sufficiently camouflaged in the language of science and technology that they don't see it that way. I mean, I've given talks where people are, it's not Christians who are insulted that I'm comparing, alien beliefs to religion. It's the alien believers. Right. They don't see it that way. But yeah, your work definitely kind of was a big inspiration for kind of looking at these sort of substitutes, and it does seem to have something to do. And we did the research that you just described. It does seem, and this is why we call the paper "We're Not Alone." It does seem to have something to do with this, with this idea that we can't just be a fluke. Like we can't we have to be part of a broader cosmic community, or there has to be, and a lot of the beliefs that people have on these matters do involve these kind of powerful. They're not just another being out there. They're these kind of powerful beings that are, kind of one view is that once we pull our act together, on this planet, they'll welcome us into this cosmic community of more enlightened beings. So, I mean, there are a lot of, really, really strange beliefs around this. And many of the people who are into them, not all of them, of course, but many of the people who are into them, identify as totally non-religious or atheists, or even some of them will even say they're skeptics. So it is an interesting phenomenon.
Well, I mean, it would be, as Sagan always pointed out, an incredible waste of space and probabilistically very low and getting ever lower that we're alone. I mean, it would just be shocking. Yeah. So the arguments are there, and no good SETI scientist like Jill or Seth Shostak would say that, we believe that they're there, or we have faith that they're there. But why are they looking if they don't think, well, there's some pretty good reasons to think that they're probably there. Still, it's hard to get inside people's heads. I know when I think about SETI science, it kind of gives me a little, chill up my spine in the way Sagan said it there, the opening of Cosmos, where he's standing out on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Big Sur with the waves crashing, and just contemplating those kinds of questions, cosmic existential questions, does kind of harken back to a spiritual, religious, something big, grand that's in us, that we appear to really be the only species, as you point out, that can do that. I was just thinking a moment ago, I did a long Joe Rogan podcast last year with Graham Hancock, and one of his colleagues. And Graham is one of these alternative archaeologists who believes that the pyramids and the Sphinx were not built, 3,500 BC or whatever, but more like 10, 20,000 years ago. Now, much of their arguments, when you read them or listen to them, are very technical, having to do with water erosion on the side of the Sphinx and so on. And so it goes on and on like this for chapters and books and hours. But what's behind it is that, well, who are these people that built this great civilization 20, 30,000 years ago? In the middle of the Paleolithic, I mean, wow, it's still the Stone Age. Who were these people? So, of course, I push back and say, well, if these people existed somewhere, where's their trash? Where's their tools and so on? No. It was erased in this huge flood triggered by this meteor impact and so on and so forth. And again, then they dive back into the technicalities of it. But when you kind of read the broader oeuvre of Graham Hancock's research, all his books and lectures, there is this sense that these people are these wise people, this great advanced moral, technically sophisticated, morally advanced, superior people, and they were sending us a message through these artifacts and so on that there's this certain cycle in the Earth's orbit that causes these meteor explosions and so on and so forth. But again, it was back to the, now, as far as I know, Graham Hancock's an atheist like you and I are, but he still has this sense that there's something else out there, or they were there, and they're still communicating with us. And it's like this deep spiritual, like I'm sitting there across from him in Joe's studio going, oh my God, this guy's like super religious and he doesn't even know it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and you touched on, I think one of the features that unifies it with a lot of religion, and I talk about this in my book, that of course there are varying degrees of dogmatism, and people that are really, really like hardcore believers versus the people that are more just seekers or curious. But a lot of this seems to be about hope, right? Like so this is a spirit. They're envisioning the superior, more morally advanced species, in the same way that a lot of traditional religious people think that there's the goal is to be better, right? To aspire to that there's a better world, there's a better human, there's a better self. And so a lot of and this is one of the things that we've actually gotten, and I get into this in my book a little bit, but we've gone more in this direction recently, is looking at, kind of the cognitive processes that are involved in meaning and meaning making and like affirming meaning. And they do seem to be more what we would call intuitive processes as opposed to more rational processes. So it is about, for all of us, what gives our lives meanings seems to be at least partially tied to, not really thinking deeply and critically about something, but feeling it, right? So even, if you say even the social domain that we talked about, I mean, when you say you love your wife or you love your kids, you don't pull out a piece of paper and do a pros and cons list of all the positive and negative features about your spouse, right? Right? It's a feeling, right? Like when you go out in nature and you experience awe of some kind, or or something like that. Most people don't, break it down to its statistical properties. You just experience it. And what's interesting about these kinds of conspiracy theories or alien beliefs or things like that, and also religion has this feature, is it's a juxtaposition of those kind of intuitive elements, but then trying to build some kind of logical sounding or rational sounding like dogma around it, right? And so and so it seems like both those things are at play, right? People want to have like, well, here's the story, or here's the evidence, or here's the reason, but that's not really why they're into it, I don't think. I mean, it's more of this, that's just seems to be like building a rationalization for it.
Right. It
seems to be more of like this intuitive, and I'm not saying there's not rational components of, because one of the things about religion that people will point out to, in terms of kind of like historical or conservative views of religion, is that ancient wisdoms, or, people, there's actually some logical argument for certain practices, right, that are tied to things that are good for your health and safety. Well, but, I was just going to say, but the meaning component, the part of the existential part of it seems to be about these more intuitive processes. And we find this, we've got some data showing that both amongst atheists and believers, it's intuition, like that seems to be correlated. That's more correlated with meaning. And so it seems to be that
intuitive. You mean an intuitive feeling about your life or your place in the world?
So we've used like these kind of like individual difference. We've taken a kind of individual difference approach. So people vary in the extent to which they are more or less intuitive. Like some people will just say, I always trust my gut, right? Like I'm just an intuitive. Other people are more skeptical about that, right?
Yeah.
But it's like any individual difference. I mean, we all have some, like extroversion or neuroticism or anything. We all fall somewhere on it, right? And it seems to be like that, the more intuitive people are, the more they report their lives as having meaning. and also just in more intuitive states. Like I said, in nature, listening to music, falling in love, these kinds of intuitive experiences seem to be, highly associated with a perception of meaning.
Yeah, there's a reason why places like Big Sur, California, right along the coast with the waves crashing on the cliffs, or the Grand Canyon, or Sedona, Arizona, or Hawaii, some of these places that just seem to evoke those feelings more than others, which is why they're popular vacation spots.
Yeah.
That people go to get away from the city and daily life.
Yeah,
I have a
definitely.
study I cite at the beginning of Heavens on Earth that drew a lot of attention in my book tour. A 2014 survey conducted by the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture on 15,700 Americans between the ages of 18 and 60 found that 13.2% identify as atheist or agnostic, and 32% of those answered in the affirmative to the question, do you think there is life or some sort of conscious existence after death? A third of atheists are agnostic. So, they didn't ask, well, what is it you think it is? And, I'm just guessing. So I'd like your thoughts. I know Deepak Chopra, and he's got a huge following. They could be Deepak Chopra followers, or, sort of Western Buddhists, or, I'm not sure that they're whole on board with pure materialism. Maybe they think that, consciousness survives in some quantum state, or, something like that, some quasi-sciencey sounding thing. Or maybe they go for the Ray Kurzweil, we're going to be uploaded into the cloud when the singularity comes and all that. Yeah. But, what are your thoughts on what those 1/3 of atheists and agnostics are thinking when they think they're going to continue on?
Yeah. One thing that I'm excited about is we got a grant to look at this, a number of years back, is there's been, until recently, there's been relatively little research on atheists. And so the idea, I think, was if you're an atheist, then that's it. There's nothing multidimensional about it, right? It's just you're an atheist. And so if you look at, the survey you mentioned, if you look at Pew data on atheists, there are some interesting, sometimes it seem like contradictions, sometimes it seem like intricacies of that there might be different types of atheists out there, right? Not all atheists. So one thing I think that we have, and I actually bring this up a lot in my field. I think one thing I think that people like you and I and other scholars have a bias towards is we tend to populate the world with brains like our own. Like we all do that, right? At some level, right? Here's kind of the way I see things, so other people see it the same ways. And so if you have, for example, in like an atheist, in like kind of an active atheist or secular movement, if you have a bunch of people that see atheism the same way, who's to say that that's not a self-selected sample of atheists that all see things the same way? And there's a whole bunch of other atheists out there that have a totally different view of what atheism means. And so I do think that there are dimensions of what it means to be an atheist. I think some people say they're an atheist and they're not really even rejecting a belief in a deity. They're rejecting a traditional religion, and they just call themselves atheists. I think in the Pew data, there is like this discrepancy where it's something like there's something like quite a few more people will say they don't believe in God than will say they're an atheist. Right. So, these numbers should match at some level. Right?
Yeah. But the word is contaminated with
the word's contaminated. So some people don't believe in God, and but they won't call themselves an atheist because they think atheist is some kind of social activism, or
right.
It's antagonistic. There's atheists are, as you know, are a highly stigmatized group. I think that's changing, but. So some people just don't. I think particularly women. There's a gender difference.
Yeah.
Some of that gender difference might be neurocognitive. I think there's some evidence for that. But some of that gender difference might just be like women don't want to be associated with something that they see as socially undesirable. And maybe male atheists are just more likely to be like, I don't care, whatever.
Right.
But then there is this. So even ignoring that, like there does seem to be like within atheism, like an individual difference of spirituality. And, this is something we're actually looking into are there characteristics of spirituality that would predict, again, this gets back to our substitution hypothesis of people that have rejected a belief in a deity, for instance, but still have some kinds of supernatural metaphysical orientations. They're not, like you said, they're not pure materialists, but they believe in something. Or, another point I try to make is that there's a lot of people, theists or atheists, that they vary in degree of confidence in their beliefs. So there are people that are very confident in their belief in God, and people that are very confident in their rejection of that. But there's just a ton of people out there who will, if you just honestly probe them, they'll say, I don't know, like, I err on the side of believing, but some days I'm just like, I don't know, how could there be a God? Look at all the suffering that's going on.
Right.
And other days I feel a little bit more optimistic. So I think there are those complexities too. So I think that we need a lot more knowledge about, atheists as not just this kind of, like very.
Yeah, certainly. After Dawkins' book came out in 2006, the God Delusion, that kind of divided the atheist community. I remember watching this unfold, that, you either were an anti-theist going after religion along the lines of Richard and Hitch, maybe slightly less so for Sam, and probably Sam would be in that category, maybe slightly less so for Dan Dennett. But then there's also this sort of social justice warrior branch of atheism. They even call themselves Atheism Plus. The plus is social justice. So automatically, this is sort of a politically a far left, far liberal social justice movement that also happens to be atheists. And so I could see why a lot of people would go, whoa, I'm not an atheist then, if that's what it means to be an atheist. Or if I have to attack religious believers, I don't want to do that. What am I? I'm not an atheist, but I don't believe in God. So that could account for some of that discrepancy.
Yeah, no, I think so. And, I think there are, and like I said, I think there are, kind of a lot of people that don't really fit into any kind of category. So, for instance, there was some research a few years back that looked at this concept of being angry at God, having anger towards God. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon because there were people that identified as atheists but were angry at God, which seems like a weird paradox, right? Like, why be angry at something that you think doesn't exist?
Right.
And so to me, that suggests that there are at least some people who are rejecting not the belief that there is a God, but they're rejecting God, like he's real. And they might call themselves, atheists. And of course, there's a whole bunch of people that just call themselves, agnostic, that don't fall into that. Category. But I do think there is, even among atheists, I do think there's evidence, that we have some evidence that there's variability in, what you might call a spiritual inclination. And it seems like the higher an atheist is on this kind of spiritual orientation, the more likely they are to kind of be at least open into going into these kind of alternative beliefs that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Just to remind our listeners, much of what we've been talking about is in your book, Supernatural, Death, Meaning, and the Power of the Invisible World. It's really a good read and packed with data, which I love. So let's just start generally. What do you mean by supernatural? That's the title of your book. What is the supernatural?
Yeah, so the way I basically define supernatural is any kind of idea or concept or belief that is outside of what we know through an empirical understanding of the world. So if we can't study it, through natural methods, through empirical methods, then it's something beyond that. And so, which I think is distinct from the broader category of magical thinking. I mean, you could believe in conspiracies, for instance, that don't involve any kind of supernatural forces beyond the material, right? But it's still magical thinking in the sense that you don't really have an empirical justification for doing so. So I'm really talking about like these kinds of non-material, forces that we almost by definition we say are outside of our scientific understanding of the world.
Yeah, I think you and I probably agree on that in terms of how it applies to agents like God. But someone like Deepak would push back and say, well, but consciousness is this one category of so it's not quite supernatural. It might be that the physical instantiation of consciousness in our physical beings, but he describes consciousness as the ground of all being, the ontological primitive. I think for a lot of Buddhists, at least of the Western kind, like Deepak, consciousness is kind of a supernatural. It's just sort of out there. And you can't measure it in the same way you measure other things other than this kind of internal reflection through meditation, which to me doesn't give us objective knowledge. But it does have the feeling. And again, maybe that's part of where some of these atheists are going and thinking about their own spirituality, their existential meaning, life after death, and so on, is this kind of quasi-supernatural idea of consciousness.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't take that position myself. I mean, I take a more material position of consciousness. We might not, simply because we don't understand fully the neuroarchitecture and the processes involved in it. That's been the case for psychology forever, right? People have postulated ideas that, and kind of come up with these, kind of semi-supernatural explanations of the mind because, we simply were unable to interrogate the actual at the brain level what was going on. So yeah, I mean, but I'm not real familiar with that kind of view of consciousness.
Yeah. But just kind of going through some of these deeper issues in your book, you get personal here, talking about your father, who eventually succumbed to this degenerative neurological disease. Was that ALS that he had, or something like that?
He had what's called multiple systems atrophy, which is it's very Parkinson's-like. But it's got you don't live as long, and it's characterized by your brain kind of loses its ability to regulate blood pressure, so you pass out a lot. But it has a lot of kind of Parkinson's symptomology. Right.
And you talk about his faith helped him go through this process, this dying process. And obviously you're not sitting there with him going, Dad, there's no God. Right. I mean, the problem is that, that in the larger question, what do you say to somebody who's dying, Shermer, when I'm in a debate or something, religion at least gives the believer some kind of hope that they're not really dying or they're going somewhere else. And to the person sitting there, their healthy family members, it gives them something to say. I have to say, I really don't know what to say other than like what I said to my mom when she was dying, just a life well lived. I love you. We love you. And so on, that kind of thing that secularists do. But I have to admit, it doesn't sound as appealing that the other story sounds like. And here I'm reminded of Ricky Gervais's movie, The Invention of Lying. Have you seen this? Oh my God, you have to watch this.
That's good.
Yeah, The Invention of Lying. So it starts off. It's just kind of a fun comedy to start, where he lives in this world where everybody always tells the truth, and so that's kind of funny. And then he goes to the bank and to make a withdrawal, and the teller just asks him, "Well, how much money do you have in your account?" And he just says, but he makes a mistake. And so she gives him this incorrect amount, all based on trust. And he walks out of the bank realizing, oh, my God, I can actually lie and people will believe me. And then the first woman to come along on the sidewalk, passing him, he says, we have to have sex right now or the world's going to end. This is such a guy's fantasy. And she said, well, do we have time to get a hotel room or do we do it right here? Anyway, it starts off, it's very fun. But then it gets kind of dark and more sensitive and thoughtful, where his mother is dying, and she says they're in the hospital room with people around, and she says, well, what's going to happen to me? And again, it's like, here's that moment. And he says, well, Mom, when you die, everybody gets a mansion, and it's a big, beautiful mansion, and you give all this great clothes and food, and it's gets to be life is great, and so and the people around them then report, because they're all thinking no one lies, right? So pretty soon word spreads around the town that that this guy, Ricky Gervais' character, knows what happens, and everybody gets a mansion, and now he's become like Moses. And anyway, this funny little scene where he orders pizza, and he's got these 2 pizza boxes, and he makes some notes on the back of the pizza boxes, like, this is how we should live our lives. And it's like the 10 Commandments. So he comes out with like these 2 tablets of pizza boxes telling people, why they should be good and so on, without this belief in God. But they all think he's this guru. But, it's sort of a fun way of thinking, well, what would you say? If we don't want to lie and make up some story, but on the end, you don't want to be hurtful and take something away from somebody that might give them peace or comfort.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I suspect that most people who, who have deep faith, their faith isn't contingent on what you saying, whether you believe it or not. And I think most people also have some sense of, what we might call social decency or something with it. It's that there's certain times that aren't the time to, challenge people or, people, I think most people are kind of pretty good at sort of reading the social situation. But I mean but this gets to a bigger issue, I think, which is, and you actually touch on this, in your book in your recent book about the, where did this idea, there were these very specific ideas of afterlife come from, and are they intrinsically part of Christianity or any other religious narrative? And we have very, particularly kind of in like modern America, there are these like very kind of odd, right, views about the afterlife that are almost like you're saying, they're this very literal, like, oh, there's gonna be some place in heaven where I have some sense of how I look now, or in the relation, so there is that kind of very, very specific view, but then as you talk about, there's all these other sorts of views about what heaven means, or if there is even a heaven, or what's the point. And a lot of this, to me, it gets to your issue about when you're sitting there with somebody that you love and they're dying, a lot of this is that kind of social, that social fear or worry. I mean, one of the reasons I think that many people get upset when a family member leaves the religion is, it's not that they're not worried about their, maybe they're really worried about their soul, of course, but it is kind of this notion of a bond, like this bond, right, that we don't want to lose, right? We don't want to lose when we're reconnected somewhere. And so there is this, this immortality idea of that we're, that it's a loss, it's death is a social loss. It's a form of social pain. And so this idea that we don't want you just to go into nothing and be alone, and we don't want to be alone. And so even these kind of more like alternative religious views that don't imagine like a heaven kind of utopia still have some sense of our spirits are going to return to the earth, and we're all connected. I mean, the theme is always some kind of connection.
Right.
Is there maybe you would know this more than I, is there like any kind of afterlife worldview that involves you just being by yourself?
No. It's all connected.
Yeah. So it seems like that's,
that would just be painful. That's like solitary confinement forever. Yeah. No, that would not be good. Here I'm reminded of Christopher Hitchens' comment about the Christian heaven being like celestial North Korea. Where you have that dictator that knows everything you're thinking. Yeah. I had when I was reading your book, I was thinking about the humanists and the transhumanists, and then I come across this group I never heard of that you wrote about. Small group of transhumanists founded by the Mormon Transhumanist Association, based on the belief that Mormonism and transhumanism share a number of similar ideas. I had never thought of that. Notably, both perspectives advance the idea of improving human life and seeking some form of transcendence. Talk about that for a second.
Yeah, no, you can Google their webpage. They might even have a Twitter. But it is this, and this kind of gets to that, continuity idea we were talking about with nostalgia. I think there's a lot of people that will have some sense of, even if they don't believe in, I mean, there's a lot of people, for one, I think, that are religious and go to church that don't believe, actually. Yeah. That they see that there's a lot of things about it that they like. And even if they're not outright atheists, they're not confident, and they don't have like a strong sense of belief in afterlife. And they're like, there's so many cool things about this. This is what binds our community together. And so I think there are these people, and these Mormon transhuman, they seem to largely be males, highly educated, who, are in engineering or tech or this kind of stuff. And so which are usually the types of people that are into transhumanism. And, but this sense of trying to reconcile it with what is a very family oriented, religion, right? Mormonism.
Totally.
And being, maintaining that connection. So I actually wouldn't be surprised at all if we see, as we see Christianity continue to decline. I mean, if you look at the numbers in the U.S. of young people in particular, I'm not talking about people that are atheists, but just rejecting traditional religion.
Yeah,
I mean, these numbers are going up, and as I point out in the book, these numbers are as religion declines, it seems like interest in all these other ideas increases.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if you see these kind of hybrids of people saying, you know what, I like these features of Christianity because that connects me to my ancestors. It connects me to where I'm from. The people. When we lived in England, we had this really interesting experience when we enrolled our kids in school. Because in the U.S. we have separation of church and state. If you take your kids to public school, the school doesn't ask you what your religion is.
Right.
But when we took our kids when we enrolled them in school in England and we were filling out these forms, they were like, well, what's your religion? I was like, oh, we don't want to put anything down. And they're like, oh, no, you have to put something down. And I was like, no, you could not have a religion, right? And they're like, no, everyone has a religion. And I was like, so there was this weird, it was a little bit, even though it was English speaking country, there was a little bit of this, disconnect between really what they were asking is, who are your people? Like, where are you from?
Right.
Are you part of the Church of England? Are you Catholic?
Right.
Are you Muslim? Like, where's your, it wasn't, and in America, in our very self-oriented, individualistic American culture, to us, religion is something inside me as an individual. And I say no, yes or no.
Right.
And they were saying, no, where were you, where were your people from? Or, and so I think there is that kind of component of heritage that people, and so I wouldn't be surprised if you see these kinds of transhumanist things where they take these ideas. I mean, I don't know much. I don't know a lot of details about what Jordan Peterson's doing. But there seems to be like that kind of component.
Oh yeah, I wanted to bring him up because I was thinking about him when I was reading your book as well, because we have an issue of Skeptic coming out that has a section on Jordan. And so I wrote one of the articles and, about the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. So I didn't get into his specific claims about this or that. What's the appeal? And so I've gotten to know Jordan a little bit. And I went to one of his live events here in Southern California, 2,000 seat hall, sold out like they all are. And, it wasn't a bunch of young, angry, white, alt-right guys there. It wasn't like that at all. And it wasn't a political talk. It was more like kind of along the lines of what you're doing, what you're talking about. He's sort of putting into practice on stage of, how to find meaning in your life. And he actually harkens back to a lot of the religious texts in the argument that they figured things out long ago and they put them down in the form of stories. They're not going to write a self-help book like a Tony Robbins. Here's the 6 things you got to do: make your bed, do this and that. But they give their truths through these mythic stories. And I think that's kind of what his thing is. Not that he believes there was a literal Adam and Eve or Jesus was really resurrected or whatever. I think just to ask him, did that really happen? You're missing the point of what these stories are and what he's after there. I don't know if you followed much of the Jordan Peterson, atheists, they tend to hate him. They hate him with a passion. It's like, wow.
Yeah, I don't, I do know, obviously know who he is, and I follow, I haven't watched, I'm no expert on the content of his message. I haven't watched, he's got hours and hours of videos, right? I've seen a few of his interviews. I'm certainly familiar with the thing that got him in, kind of got him in the spotlight to begin with, the whole gender pronoun thing and its criticisms of postmodernism and, academia. And, I actually, share a lot of his concerns in that regard. But I haven't, I should follow more closely his kind of more meaning, self-help kind of ideas. But yeah, I think that he's, from what I understand, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like he's attracting a lot of people that are, particularly maybe young males, that are looking for something to, something to latch onto. I remember having this conversation with this very kind of systemizing brain, like engineering sort of thinking guy one time, and he was talking about his religion, and he's like, and it seemed very similar to what you're talking about. And he's like, I don't have any sense of what's true, of any of these things being true, but when you're navigating through life, you need some kind of model, and what model kind of best fits, right? And it kind of works, and in the Bible, or what it was kind of this kind of Christian worldview is kind of seems like it kind of works out for people. Like it seems like people who like really follow it carefully, and who live with a kind of discipline, the self-discipline that gets you out of that keeps you from a lot of trouble. And kind of the motivation to be good to your neighbors, and that to be honest, that's the world as I talk about it a bit in the book, that's kind of the world I grew up in. I mean, I grew up in a Christian world that didn't have any of the problems that we often hear about. Like my parents weren't anti-science or anything like that. I mean, if anything, it was like, you better do really well in school, and you better respect your teachers, and they're the authority. If they say something, they know what they're talking about. Listen to your science teachers.
Right. Well, good.
So yeah. So I know the other exists, but there wasn't. Certainly we learned these stories in church, and I think my parents believed them, but there was never like, oh no, you have to believe this. You have to believe the creation story of the Bible. You can't believe in Darwinian science. I just don't. Maybe I don't. You don't. It's hard to remember childhood.
Yeah.
You have rose-tinted glasses, but I just got the this kind of thing that you're supposed to live. Being a Christian means like modeling the behavior of Christ, right? And helping the poor, thinking about others, trying to live with dignity and discipline, and so I think that I can see where people would Jordan's promoting that kind of view, with the idea of you don't have to believe in the literal truth of these things. That's not what's important. What's important is the inspirational mythology. In the guidebook, then I can certainly see where people don't want to live lives in chaos, right? Where they have no model of how to live or how to be, or what to believe in.
And that's going to get worse if what you just said earlier about the iGens, the Gen Zs, younger people, millennials, and so on, giving up religion. Where are they going to find it?
Yeah.
And so far, the sort of leading atheist writers have not produced like, here's the manual. You'd probably have to go more to humanist writers. And so I think a lot of Jordan's younger audience, to that extent, that's what they're interested in, is, well, how then do I find a life? So like even the Christ story, bearing your cross in the teeth of a world that's chaotic, dangerous, harsh. It wants you dead. If you take Jordan out of it, just look at someone like Steve Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, where he has, he catalogs what the world used to be like. Just going back a few centuries to a few tens of thousands of years ago in the Paleolithic. Chances are, you particularly males like us, we'd be dead already from most likely from violence. Just what the world is like, and so why you really need structure. And really goals and basic stuff, like, I don't know if you follow Jocko Willink. I kind of follow him for fun. He's an ex-Navy SEAL, and he's sort of a self-help guru, but grounded in reasonable good science. But he has this whole thing about he has this video called Good. So if you type in Jocko Willink, good, you'll get this little 3-minute video where, like, when bad things happen, here's what you should say: good. You didn't get the job. Good. You learned something. You failed. You lost the game. Good. You'll get better next time. And he goes through this whole thing. And so when you fall down, get up, dust off, reload, re-engage. And he's got that whole macho thing. It's really funny. But really, Jordan's kind of doing that in a more intellectual way through stories. Mm-hmm. But the principle is the same. It's basic, evolution designed us to push back against entropy, and that nature doesn't give a shit about us. We're going to die. Death is normal. That's the way things go. And so every day you have to push back against entropy by, again, the making your bed, cleaning your room. What is that? Well, because really chaos is the normal state of things. The second law of thermodynamics is just there's more ways for atoms to kind of scatter in an unorganized way than there are for atoms to organize structure in an organized way. So that's the whole point of life, is to restructure your environment to have some kind of meaning. Everything from where am I going to get my breakfast to where am I going to get my meaning? Yeah, no, I think so. And I mean and there is also this, you're talking about where are these young people going to, there does seem to be, certainly in certain facets of the, kind of young, kind of leftist culture that decided social justice or intersectionality or these ideas seem to be kind of taking on, of course, other people have noted this, taking on kind of religious aspects, and not necessarily the positive ones. I mean, on the surface, it seems like social justice seems like a positive thing, and certainly there are a lot of people out there doing a lot of good work. I'm actually working on a piece on this that it's going to come out soon, on sort of the using religion as kind of an example of how the missteps that have happened in religion, how social justice seems to be going down that same kind of same path of really using the ideas of social justice more for political posturing and self-gain, in the ways that people use religion, instead of really helping the poor and helping the needy and the most vulnerable. And so I do think there is kind of this religious like quality that does happen in these kind of secular identities where and when the reason I say not the positive side is because it does seem to be related more to the sort of victimhood culture. I mean, one of the things that my parents taught me, and you touched on this, is that suffering is fine. Like that's part of life. I mean, that's and the idea is to be the idea of gratitude, or to be thankful for you have, and what other people don't have. I mean, one of the things I remember my dad saying when he, had a death sentence, and he knew that his death wasn't, the doctors told him his death was not going to be a pleasant one, is that he said, I could sit around and feel sorry for myself. He's like, I've lived, over 70 years, and, look at all the people in the world I've had a good life. Like, look at all the people in the world that are suffering. And so his religion wasn't just about like having some sense of an afterlife. It was also about this putting things in perspective of being grateful for what he'd been given. And in addition to that, after my dad died, I remember my mom, because my mom's younger than 10 years younger than my dad, and she hadn't retired yet. She was getting ready to retire, and they had all these plans to do all this traveling and all this stuff. And then, that of course didn't happen. And I remember her saying after my dad died, saying, I could sit around and feel sorry for myself of how, poor me, I was going to retire and your dad and I were going to travel the world, or I could do something. And so, she got involved in her, church's mission where, projects where they go where, they feed the poor, and she's like, there are people, and she's like, I'm doing stuff for people, I'm doing stuff to help people in need, but she's like, it's helping me. Like it's a reminder that, something bad has happened to me, but there's people out there that don't even know how they're going to feed their kids, right. Or they might get evicted from their apartment. And so there is that kind of, that kind of element, I think, of the positive element of religion. But this kind of social justice version of it, at least what I see on campuses, doesn't really seem to be about focusing on others. It seems to be more of like a narcissistic kind of focus on your own kind of victimhood or perceived moralizing about everything, really more focused on how you feel rather than the effects you're working on.
So that worries me. If you want to even say that it has religious qualities, I would say it doesn't have the positive ones. And again, there are people obviously in community activism. There are a lot of people that you don't hear about, because they're not thought policing or or telling other people what's wrong with them. They're just out there doing good work.
Yeah.
So that, they certainly exist, and they, so I don't want to tarnish the name of social justice, because I know there are people. I mean, there are law students who are, there's these projects where they're trying to, find, help people who have been wrongly convicted. There's people doing a bunch of stuff, right, to help to make the world a better place. But what we often hear about, what Haidt talked about on campuses, and even in kind of progressive media, we often, there's this kind of call out culture and shaming, and who's more, you're not sufficiently woke, as a metric of morality. That doesn't seem to be, if that is a replacement religion, it's not a very good one.
Yeah, they seem to be kind of a dark mirror of the far right, sanctimonious blue noses running around telling everybody what they should and shouldn't do in the privacy of their bedrooms, which irritates me just as much.
Yeah.
So, when I had Heather McDonald on, she's a conservative. I'm not. So I wanted to push back a little bit and let her steel man her own arguments. By first saying, basically what I just said in so many words, that, what's all this business about family values and marriage and, you're kind of telling people how to live. So she sort of broke it down for me, like, well, but like back to what we were talking about, exactly specific things that affect people's lives. Like, so what's the purpose of encouraging marriage? Well, the number one predictor of poverty today, there's three things you can do to stay out of poverty: graduate from high school, get a job, don't have kids until you get married. If you fail at any of those three, or particularly all three, you will live in poverty your whole life. Yeah. It really comes down to, something like a young woman who gets pregnant that's not married and has no financial support. She's doomed financially. I mean, it's just very difficult to live life at, right on the edge, right on the margins of life like that. And so sometimes these conservative values that we kind of poo-poo, they actually have pragmatic effects on people's lives, which is why, to steel man the conservative argument, that they're actually want to help society, even though it sounds like they're just poking their nose in people's private business. They actually have a like the social justice warriors, they do want to make society better.
Yeah. And there are certainly, just like on the left, there are certainly within the conservative movement, there are certainly people that aren't as much trying to police others as they really are, motivated to help people, and they do see these factors as being very helpful. Yeah, I've seen those data that you're talking about, and it also has implications for when people talk about racial inequality. Similarly, I know there's been some research on if you're African American and you come from, if your parents are married, if you come from a two-parent home, your life outcomes are just better and approach closer to, the outcomes of, white Americans, than if you come from a broken home. And so, there are people that are talking about these issues of saying, well, even if you're concerned about inequality or racial inequality or, outcomes, you got to look beyond just the identity, the surface level identity factors of black versus white or male versus female or whatever. And what are the underlying variables that are at play? And family structure and neighborhood structure and, sort of household goals and priorities and those things seem to really matter. And from that perspective, I think this is one of the bad things about the lack of viewpoint diversity on college campuses is there are, like Heather McDonald, there are a lot of people that have these kind of conservative models of that could be very helpful to a lot of students. And in fact,
Heather, by the way, is an atheist. She calls herself a secular Republican, so she's in a real minority.
Yeah. So and so there are people that I think have good ideas to bring, that are ideas that at least deserve a hearing. That you don't often hear in sociology or in gender studies or in these kinds of far left departments. You don't hear people talking about, well, let's pit our view against this more conservative view and what variables predict life outcomes.
Right.
And if you had a more honest appraisal, of course, people in economics seem to be a little bit more balanced about these things. They just follow, they tend to follow the data perhaps. But if you look at these things, and there are some conservative sociologists that do kind of look at this stuff. But if you look at these things, I mean, there is some good evidence that there are certain kind of traditional values that actually are associated with positive life outcomes.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, there's probably some balance there. I just want to touch a little bit more on the transhumanists. I'm reminded of the film Transcendent Man. I don't know if you saw that documentary about Ray Kurzweil.
Mm-mm.
And again, it touches on all the themes in your book about, existential purpose and all that. And his, along with these transhumanists, is that, we are going to, like Woody Allen, they don't want to live on through their work. They want to live on in their apartment. We're just going to keep going. Yeah. And for them, the meaning of life is just to keep going. And one of the counter arguments to that, which I've never really bought, is that death gives meaning to life, that you have to have a terminus to put everything into perspective before the terminus all the way up to today. And I'm not sure if that's true or not, although I'm conflicted about it. Sometimes I think there might be something to that. If you knew you're going to live 1,000 years, that would just push the terminus off, I suppose. What if it was indefinite? I feel like I'd still have meaningful, like going out to dinner with my wife tonight would still be meaningful, even if I was going to live 200 more years or whatever. Yeah. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I've thought about it a little. I don't really know. I mean, there was this research that a number of years back that I can't remember what the specific outcome was, but I think the basic idea was that people see things that are more that meet like other things that you might think of in terms of putting value on, rarity or preciousness or something like that boosts its value, right? So if something is rare or hard to get, that we see as more valuable as something that's just commonplace that we can all have. And so this notion that this association with death and meaning might in part be because it if we see life as limited or fragile or as like precious, then it orients us to thinking like, oh, this is something to really that we should really deem as meaningful. If it's eternal, if it's permanent, then it seems like, well, what's so special about that? And I don't know, like that, and there's a difference. Like I said, I can't remember the specific outcomes because there's a difference, of course, between, as we've talked about, between what people think, why they think something's meaningful versus why it really is, perhaps. But yeah, so I don't know. I mean, it's hard to we don't have that condition to run because we all die.
That's right. Yeah. Although even if Kurzweil and the singularitarians turn out to be right, you can still be taken out by a bus tomorrow.
Yeah. That's true. So it could be that there's never really a way, because even if you think, well, we're all, we're all constantly, our consciousness is being constantly backed up in the cloud or whatever, somebody could take out the servers, right? Like there could be, I mean, anything, any elaborate sort of system of beaming our, data off world could still, an asteroid could hit that moon base where the data is being stored, or so. Yeah, I suppose maybe it would be hard to ever get rid of the kind of underlying like concern or anxiety about like this could all end.
And I've never agreed with the critics of cryonics that it's not natural. We have a natural lifespan and we're supposed to die. And, I would just want to go normally. Yeah. But if that used to be age 40 and then age 50 and then age 60. And at some point, if I transported you to the day before your time is up, would you like another week? Yeah. I'd like another week. How about another month? Yeah, I'll take another month. How about another decade? I'll take another decade, of course. Yeah. And that would continue on because as long as you're healthy and you're not feeling, on the verge of death or suicide or whatever, of course you're going to want to keep going. Yeah. But again, evolution designed our nature to be just want to stay alive and push back against entropy. So that I don't see any reason that has to stop. But but there's something also that I find in talking to people like Kurzweil and others, the transhumanists, they seem kind of obsessed with death. Along the lines of your early chapter on terror management theory, they seem to be one of those that supports that in the sense that, Ray, he doesn't seem like a happy guy to me. He seems like he was obsessed with death. It's like, dude, don't miss out on life because this is what we know. Whether the hereafter is coming, we live in the here and now. So, don't miss out. on today.
Yeah. Do you know if that'd be interesting actually to see if there's any, do you know if there's any data on like personality and I mean, are transhumanists more likely to be high in neuroticism or?
I've not
or
seen that.
something like that?
We should get that. We should do that study.
'Cause that would be
you and I should
interesting,
do
right?
some studies together.
If there is an anxiety, yeah, we should,
yeah.
sure. If there is an anxiety kind of dimension um, to that, because there are. I mean, one of the things that that I think is interesting when kind of looking at individual differences of personalities, there do seem to be these kind of characteristics that aren't just. It's not just whether or not someone's a believer or not that's often most fascinating. It's like these other characteristics of whatever it is that they're into, how they do it, right? And so there does seem to be this component of people who are atheists that are still like very, very worried about worried about death, and not even just transhumanists, but there's people that they take all sorts of different they get on to every kind of alternative medicine, regardless of its empirical standing, right? They just seem to be obsessed with staying healthy and alive, and they're afraid to travel, or they're just they're afraid of toxins in the air.
So our prediction would be they're high risk averse, low in openness to experience, high in neuroticism. Not sure about the others. Probably maybe low in agreeableness. I don't know. Hard to say. So let's do that study.
That would be a cool study.
Yeah. So many interesting topics here in the book, but we're coming up on 2 hours here. One of the sections or one of the paragraphs that I thought was beautifully written from you. Perhaps there are those with the preparation and discipline to live a life nearly free of supernatural inclinations, but I doubt there are many. And based on the research, many of the people who think that supernatural ideas and beliefs do not affect their attitudes and behaviors are simply wrong. So I wrote there, what are yours?
What are mine? That's a good question, because I'm sure, like a lot of people, I envision myself as this, amazingly rational being. One thing I would say about myself doing, that I think is kind of ironic is doing this. Like I said, I grew up in a very religious kind of conservative environment. And then I went to college, and I thought, one of the coolest things about going to college is you can ask anything, you can. The sky's the limit on, there's no like parameters holding you back. Like there's nothing off limits. And, that's actually one of the reasons that I think I get so irritated about all this campus censorship stuff. It's just like, no, campus isn't a church, right? Like
Right.
This isn't supposed to be a dogma. There isn't supposed to be things you can say and can't say and that kind of thing. But anyway, so I think that I have a particular sensitivity towards that stuff, because that's not what, when I went to college, I was like, what makes this really cool is people are challenging dogma, right?
Right.
But anyway, what's interesting is that, I think I went into this world of academia saying, I don't want anything to do with any of this kind of the superstitious stuff, supernatural stuff, and just also the kind of touchy, like a lot of young, when I was young, like a lot of young men, I was like, I don't want to do with any of this touchy-feely emotions, stuff like holding hands and, that kind of, I'm not really interested in that. But, the older I get and the more I actually study this stuff, which is part of what makes it ironic from a kind of a quantitative or empirical point of view, the more sympathies I have towards religion. Not necessarily from the perspective of saying, hey, I want to jump in full force or anything like that. But I think I begin to understand it more, and I begin to see it more as, and I know this is kind of controversial in some atheist circles, where religion is seen, where people almost have like a blank slate view, where religion is just something that's taught to you, and then people reject it. Well, I kind of, I think that there's, some growing evidence that, certainly specific religions are taught to you, of course, through social learning. But I take this more bottom-up approach now, and I think there's data to support this, that there's a lot of it is like a personality trait. I mean, people just kind of naturally vary in their cognitive orientation towards belief. People have different levels of comfort with throwing themselves into things that there's not evidence for. People have different levels of interest in, kind of spiritual ideas or practices. And a lot of this seems to be kind of like an individual difference. I think all or most people kind of need meaning, but not everyone needs to turn to religion for meaning, of course. But it does seem to be the case, and we've published some studies on this. People who score higher on the trait of need for meaning are more likely to be religious.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does seem to be that need and some other cognitive factors orient people towards belief. So, I've kind of, and maybe this is just a function of age too. Like I've kind of, the older you get, the more humbled you are, right? And so I've kind of also just come around to being like, I don't know the answers or whatever, and people are into different things. And so I think the best efforts that I can see, towards, countering religion is not to counter it wholesale, not to say religion's bad or be anti-theist or anything like that, but to say there are certain dimensions of it that are bad, right?
Right.
And you don't have to abandon Christianity or Islam or whatever to do pro-social stuff or to be a good person.
But before we wrap it up with that deeper thought, since you mentioned religion and the bad things, give us your opinion of the debate on to what extent Islamic terrorism is primarily religiously driven or politically driven. There's this huge split between an atheist community about this, and I'm kind of conflicted about it. I can see arguments on both sides. Robert Wright makes great arguments for why it's mostly political. Sam Harris makes great arguments for why it's mostly religious. I don't know. Have you given much thought to that? You write a little bit about it in the book.
Yeah, I'm also conflicted about it too. I do think that it's both. I mean, I think that I definitely think that you can take, because we have historical examples of atrocities and pain and suffering and caused by secular ideology. I mean, you can just look at the devastation caused by communist regimes,
right?
That we're trying to be entirely secular. But I do think that there is this interesting cocktail of political ideologies emboldened or energized by supernatural beliefs, right? So it's not necessarily one or the other, perhaps. But if you're trying to mobilize people on the battlefield or whatever, to have that extra supernatural component seems to be powerful. There was a recent study looking at simulated knife fights, and the people who'd prayed or some that if you had some kind of religious condition where people pray, they were bolder and more confident in combat. And so there does seem to. So I think it would be a mistake to say. I kind of agree with Sam Harris in the sense that it would be a mistake to ignore these very specific supernatural beliefs that seem to be present in Islamic extremism. And in the same way, I would say this about like any sort of Christian fundamentalism. I mean, if you look at people who have died, if you look at children who have died because their parents won't get them modern medical treatment, but instead rely on faith healing, that seems to be religious, right? It's very, very supernatural. So I don't think we should. I think it's a mistake to try to say that religion or supernatural beliefs have nothing to do with that. But I would also say those aren't enough too. Maybe like it seems to be this kind of combination. That's about as political, balanced of an answer I can give.
I'm taking one of these the great courses, teaching company courses on religious violence that they just released. It's really quite good. I mean, it gives the whole perspective, going back thousands of years and all over the world of violence related to religion, and it really does show what a narrow slice of time we happen to be in right at this moment when Islamic terrorism related to their religious beliefs and supernatural beliefs is definitely there. But there's nothing unique about that. It's always been that way. And again, if you and I were having this conversation in the 70s, we'd be talking about revolutionary Marxists and what drives them to blow themselves up and so forth.
Yeah.
But thinking back to wrapping it up here of these sort of useful fictions, I call them, things that I don't have evidence for, and maybe even counter evidence that I go ahead and believe anyway, like free will. So, I'm a determinist in the sense that, I agree, we live in a determined universe. Yet I'm a compatibilist in the sense I think we're active agents within the determined universe, and we can take in information and then alter our behavior and change our goals and so on, unlike the mouse that can't do that as much as we can, Dan Dennett's degrees of freedom and so on. But at the end of the day, when I'm just walking around, I feel like I'm a libertarian free willist. Like there's a little homunculus Michael Shermer calling the shots, and I guess there's a little mini me inside him or whatever. I don't even think of it. It's totally non-intellectual. And if I thought about it, I probably wouldn't even move. So there's certain things that we just have to assume and sort of take, not quite supernatural, but something along the lines of this invisible world you talk about.
Right.
I was also reading that chapter, thinking about the economy and the whole, stock market and money. It's all just sort of this invisible world of make-believe that has no value. We haven't been on the gold standard in a century. It's fiat money. It's just binary digits moved around on the screen. What's the real value of a stock? All this, we all kind of just take on faith it's just going to keep going as long as we all keep pretending that it's all has value and keeps going. And anyway, that's another one of those, or democracy. You've all Noah Harari talks about. All of this is just kind of this fiction, a myth, a story we've just created, and we all live our lives in the middle of it. But it's not at all like something you'd point to in an empirical way or a scientific way.
No, I think that's right. I mean, so getting back to, because I kind of dodged the question, I think, when you asked me, is I think I kind of have a similar view about, like patriotism. Like, I think I like really believe in the American, sort of American dream, American vision, and of the idea of what we could, not necessarily, I'm not ignorant to historical facts of, some of the bad things that we've done by any means. But there is this, I like to be an optimistic about it, an idealist about it. And I think there's something cool about being an American and, believing in this country and believing that it's like the best, I guess I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's the best country on the planet, but, I think there is something kind of special about about our experiment, the American experiment. And you could certainly say, well, there's a certain level of that where I'm just taking a leap of faith. But I think it's adaptive, right? I think it's, it certainly seems to be more beneficial towards orienting me to the future and wanting to make the world better than having a very, very cynical view of, well, everything sucks. America's just a hellhole, and the Western world's a hellhole, and it's just this kind of this very, very negative view that you sometimes see doesn't seem to be a very good, it seems to be an alternative, a darker fiction, perhaps. That doesn't seem to be a very helpful one.
Yeah, I agree. And I wonder if you'd go so far as I do in saying, I don't know what happens after we die. Nobody does. Yeah. If there's an afterlife and it's not celestial North Korea, I'll be pleasantly surprised. Yeah. And so when Deepak says, see you on the other side, Shermer, I'm like, okay, if you're right, sure. And we all return to some conscious state or whatever, okay.
I think that's the best way. And and of course you point this out in your book. I mean, I think it's I think being obsessed with the afterlife, or even maybe like the transhumanist thing, like if you're so obsessed with not dying or finding something that's coming after that you don't know is there or not, it really does take you away from as you would say, I guess, heaven on earth, right? Of trying to make trying to make the best of this world. And I honestly think that despite some of the claims of more outspoken, Christians and, religious people, from my experience, most Christians are kind of living that way. They're like, we have to take care of this. I mean, I remember my dad was an early environmentalist and, and was like, we have to take care of this planet. God gave us this planet, right? Like he gave it to us as this is our home, right? We have to take care of it. And so, And so there are certainly, a lot of Christians that kind of have that view of we have dominion over this planet, and this is our home, and we need to take care of it and our families. And even people who say they believe that the apocalypse is happening in our lifetime, or in the next 10 years, are still going to work and saving for their kids' college and
yeah,
doing
right.
So
right.
it's not, I'm not totally convinced that they're
Right.
hardcore believe. There obviously are apocalyptic cults, but most people kind of say these things or, sort of identify with these things, but their life behavior suggests otherwise, I think.
Yeah, it's another observation I make that it seems like religious people, Christians in particular, grieve as much as anybody when someone dies or their own death is pending. If they really believe that the afterlife, is coming and this is just a temporary staging area to move on to the next stage, it seems like they wouldn't grieve as much, but they do. So I often wonder if that's because grief is independent of what you believe about the afterlife,
Yeah.
or if maybe they harbor just a little doubt, like, well, maybe it's not 100%.
Yeah, I think that, yeah. I think they harbor doubt probably, or a lot of them. And also it's just, like you said, it is this, something's being severed right now, like whether, and then you don't, and then there is a uncertainty. I mean, doubt. And there's a lot of course, religious scholars that talk about openly, like that doubt's a good thing, right? Like this, that this is, that's why you call it a leap of faith, right? It's you don't have certainty.
Right.
Like
right.
you have hope.
Right.
And there's you hope there's some promise of something, but you don't really have any reason to believe it,
Right.
Beyond that faith. So,
Right. Well, Clay, we've just hit 2 hours, so we're moving into Joe Rogan territory now. I don't want to compete with Joe and go 3 or 4 hours.
Anyway.
yeah. The book again is Supernatural: Death, Meaning, and the Power of the Invisible World. It's a great read. Congratulations on the book, and look forward to reading the next one and doing some research with you. That'll be great.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, Michael.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.